I was halfway through folding laundry when I heard the knock. Not the impatient kind. Just a simple two-tap rhythm like someone who wasn't sure they'd be welcome. Opened the door and there he was, Ben, my ex-husband's son. We hadn't seen each other since the funeral last spring. He'd grown into himself in a way I couldn't quite place. The awkward energy he used to carry like a second backpack was gone. Now he had a quiet stillness, like someone who'd figured out how to sit in his own skin. He held a cardboard box full of vinyls, an old turntable balanced on top, a laptop under one arm. No suitcase? Just nodded and said, "Hey, I didn't ask why you was here. Not yet." I stepped aside. "Come in." He walked in like he remembered the place, the creaky step near the hallway, the kitchen that always smelled like basil, even when I hadn't cooked in days. We hugged and it wasn't awkward. He felt taller, heavier, more grounded. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said once we were inside, dropping his stuff by the couch. "Where else would I be?" He gave a half smile. "Yeah, right." We sat for a while just talking about nothing. The weather. A podcast he was into. I asked how his mom was doing, even though I knew they weren't close. He shrugged. Same. Distracted. Married to some guy with opinions about salmon. At some point, I made tea. He helped, pulling mugs from the same cupboard he used to complain about. Why is everything so high up? Now he just reached without comment. It wasn't until later, when he started flipping through the vinyls, old Bowie, some Talking Heads, a couple jazz records I didn't recognize, that I noticed how easily he'd slipped into the house. Into my space, into a part of me I hadn't looked at in a long time. There was this moment, small but sharp. I was standing by the sink, rinsing out the teapot, and he was crouched by the turntable, setting it up like it was a ritual. And I caught myself watching him. Not just watching, noticing. The way his hands moved, careful but certain. The way he hummed along with the needle scratch before the music kicked in. I turned back to the sink. Water running too hot, but I didn't pull away. I just let it sting a little. That night, he took the guest room. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the muffled sound of a Miles Davis record floating through the floor. Not loud enough to disturb, just enough to make me feel like I wasn't alone. I didn't know why he came and he didn't offer, but it didn't feel random. And that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I slept with the window open, listening to the soft hum of a late spring night. Trying not to feel anything. Failing completely. The next day started slow, like most Saturdays in this house tend to do. I was wiping dust off the window frame in the hallway when Ben appeared in the doorway with a grin and a box cradled in both arms. The one I'd been pretending didn't exist for years. The one labeled Junk Photos Garage. We ended up on the cold cement floor of the garage, legs crossed like we were kids, the open box between us. The smell of old cardboard and mothballs clung to the air, and every time I reached in and pulled out another envelope of prints or a yellowing photo album, I felt like I was sifting through someone else's life. In a way, I was mine, but two or three versions ago. Ben took his time looking through them, pausing longer than most people would. He wasn't just flipping through, he was remembering, or maybe reconstructing. He pulled out a photo of me at some long-forgotten summer cookout, hair pulled back and falling apart, my face red from the sun or wine or both. I was holding a pie I definitely hadn't baked myself, mid-laugh, eyes crinkled, caught in that blurry moment between jokes. He looked at it for a long time before holding it up and saying, not in a teasing way, not with any sort of agenda, "That's how I remember you." I didn't have a script for that moment. I tried to laugh it off. Made a face like it was just nostalgia doing its usual trick, but the thing was, I didn't feel embarrassed. I didn't feel exposed. Just seen in a way I hadn't been in a very long time. We spent hours out there, time sliding by like it had somewhere else to be. He told me about the city he'd been living in, about his roommate who never bought toilet paper, about his job editing short documentaries for a nonprofit that never seemed to have enough funding. His life sounded loose, untethered, sometimes frustrating, but oddly light. I told him bits and pieces about mine too, though I noticed I mostly talked about things I used to do, books I used to read, trips I used to dream about taking, the cafe I used to think I'd open when I was less tired. It didn't feel sad at the time. It just felt true. Later that evening, without asking, Ben started making dinner. He found things in the fridge I didn't remember buying, tossed together. some roasted vegetables, and somehow made the tired piece of fish in the freezer taste like it came from a restaurant. I poured wine and we ate at the kitchen counter instead of the dining table, which had somehow turned into more of a dumping ground than a place to sit. We talked through the meal. Not in that performative way you do with guests, but like two people quietly relieved not to be alone. I asked him what scared him the most lately, and he said, wasting time. Or maybe not knowing how to stop wasting it. I told him I sometimes forget what actually matters to me, or if I even get to have that conversation with myself anymore. He looked at me then, not with pity, not with judgment, just this kind of steady calm, and I remember thinking, God, this is easy. Too easy. The way the words came out of both of us, like they'd been circling the room for months, just waiting for the right ears. After we cleaned up, he put on a record again, something slow and low, and I found myself lingering in the kitchen longer than I needed to, watching the way he leaned back against the counter, how comfortable he looked. Not in the make-yourself-at-home way, but something quieter, like he had always belonged in this kind of quiet dot. It was only later, when I was brushing my teeth and saw myself in the mirror, that I realized I hadn't felt the usual weight. Behind my eyes, the one that settled there most evenings when I tried to convince myself this version of life was enough. That night, I didn't dream, but I woke up once in the middle of the night with that blurry photograph still in my mind. Me laughing, unguarded, completely unaware of being watched. I had the strangest feeling then, like something had been moved, ever so slightly, in the foundation of my life, and I couldn't quite tell yet if it was a shift towards something better or a slow slide into something I couldn't undo. It was. Sometime past midnight, when I walked down the hallway for water and caught the faint sound of his voice through the slightly open door to the guest room, low, steady, unfiltered in that way people speak when they think no one's listening. I paused without meaning to, hands still on the banister, caught between decency and something closer to curiosity, though I won't lie, maybe a small, selfish part of me just wanted to know what lived in his private world when he wasn't looking at me with those unreadable eyes. He was on the phone. His tone soft but unsparing, a kind of conversation that had no audience except the one on the other end, which made what I heard land harder than it probably should have. He was talking about his ex, not bitterly, but like someone sifting through the pieces without trying to glue them back together. He said something about how they hadn't been right, not really, that she always wanted more from him than he had to give, and he kept trying to be more than he actually was until he just stopped recognizing himself altogether. There was a pause. Then he added, I don't think I miss her. I think I just miss being understood. And then there was silence, not from the call, but from me, standing there still as furniture, unsure whether I should feel intrusive or exposed, because something about his words peeled a layer off the story I'd been telling myself about him since he walked through the door. I waited a few minutes, then pushed the door open with a quiet knock I didn't need to fake. He looked up, surprised, but not startled, like he'd already known I was nearby, or maybe just didn't care if I had heard. Couldn't sleep, I said, stepping inside with my glass of water, the air in the room holding just enough warmth from the earlier music to make it feel inhabited. He closed his laptop and set it aside, eyes on me, not searching but steady. Do you remember how to be yourself? He asked as if that was a normal question, like it was a continuation of a conversation we'd been having silently for days. The room felt too still after he said it, but I didn't laugh or deflect. I didn't reach for something clever or safe. I just leaned against the doorframe, suddenly unsure whether the version of me he remembered, the one who laughed in photos, who once knew how to fill silence without feeling like she had to apologize, for it still existed anywhere outside of old boxes and someone else's nostalgia. I don't know, I said honestly. I'm not sure I even know who that is anymore. He nodded like that made sense, not in the patronizing way people sometimes do when they're pretending to get it, but like someone who's asked themselves the same thing and didn't get a satisfying answer either. There was no heavy pause, no dramatic silence begging to be broken. We just stayed like that for a few moments, him sitting on the edge of the bed with the lamp casting soft shadows on the floor, and me standing at the threshold of a space that felt somehow more mine than the bedroom I actually slept in. Eventually, I said goodnight and left, but the question stayed with me long after I got back under the covers. It wasn't the kind of question you answer in one night, maybe not even in 1 year, but it landed in that small, undeniable way certain truths do. Not loud, but precise, like a pebble dropped in a still pond, where the ripples keep moving. Long after everything looks calm again, we hadn't planned anything for the day, which meant the hours unfolded in that open-ended way weekends sometimes do when no one's pretending to be productive and there's just enough sun to feel like you should maybe go outside, even if you don't really want to. I was reorganizing the spice rack, not out of necessity, but because it gave my hands something to do when Ben wandered in holding one of those sample paint swatches from the shed, the kind I collected. Years ago, when I thought I'd finally turn this house into something that looked more like me, even though I couldn't decide what that meant anymore. You ever gonna fix that fence? He asked, lifting one eyebrow like he already knew the answer. I gave him a look. Why are you offering to help? He shrugged with that casual confidence he'd developed somewhere along the way. I mean, if we're gonna keep avoiding real conversations, we might as well pretend to be productive. I let out a short laugh. More genuine than I expected, and 20 minutes later, we were in the car on the way to the hardware store, both of us too aware of how easy it was to fall into a rhythm again. We drove with the windows halfway down, letting the wind blur the edges of the silence, neither of us needing to fill every moment with talk. The store was half empty, the kind of big box place where everything smells like sawdust and plastic, and the music overhead never matches the time of day. We wandered past aisles of power tools and screws, arguing mildly about which paint was actually called charcoal versus slate, until we finally landed in front of a shelf of brushes and rollers, the kind of errand that doesn't mean anything on its own until something happens to make it stick. We were comparing two identical-looking cans when a man walking by glanced at us and said, in the kind of casual voice people use when they're just making small talk, "You helping your sister fix up the place?" It took a second for me to register what he'd said, and I was about to correct him politely when Ben beat me to it with a laugh. Not nervous, not uncomfortable, but with a strange edge I couldn't quite pin down. I glanced at him, expecting some kind of playful retort, but when our eyes met, I saw something quieter, almost wary, behind me amusement. I smiled at the man and let it pass, and we moved on like it hadn't mattered, but the moment didn't dissolve like those things usually do. Instead, it just sat there between us, following us down the aisle. Quiet but charged. Back in the car, neither of us said anything for a while. The trees blurred past the windows, and I stared out at them like they had something useful to say. Something to explain why the wrong assumption from a stranger had shifted the atmosphere without warning. Then, just as we turned down our street, he reached over to the stereo and started flipping through the old CDs I kept in the glove box, landing on one I hadn't listened to in years. Some indie folk album from before streaming made everything disposable. The first song started, the one I used to play on repeat during long drives when I needed to cry without giving myself permission to. Ben didn't look at me when he said it. He just stared out the windshield, one hand still on the stereo knob. Voice almost too casual. Some things aren't logic. They're chemistry. And you don't always get to vote on it. I kept my eyes on the road, kept both hands on the wheel, kept my face neutral, even though I could feel my pulse change. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a proposition. It was just a sentence. But it felt like he tossed a lit match into a room he wasn't planning to leave. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Or maybe I just didn't want to know what would happen if I did. We got back, unloaded the paint, made jokes about splinters, and left the cans in the shed like we might actually use them tomorrow. But even then, as we walked back into the house, him just a step behind me, close enough to feel, but not close enough to touch, I knew we'd already crossed some invisible line. We hadn't done anything. Not really. But whatever this was, it had stopped being nothing a long time ago. The power went out just after sunset. The kind of outage that didn't come with drama, no windstorm, no warning, just a quiet flicker, then darkness, like the house had decided to excuse itself from participating in the evening. I found a couple of candles in the drawer by the fridge, the ones that smelled faintly of vanilla and always made me feel like I was trying too hard to seem cozy. Ben was already lighting one with his phone flashlight, calm and unbothered, as if this was a scene he had lived through a dozen times before. The windows were streaked with light rain, the kind that didn't really soak anything but left the world looking like it had been rinsed and forgotten. He suggested we play a board game, not in a nostalgic or ironic way, but like he genuinely meant it. And after a few seconds of hesitation, I found myself saying yes, mostly because the Idea of sitting in the dark pretending not to feel the weight of everything between us was too unbearable. We sat on the living room floor, our knees brushing every so often under the table, each contact a spark I pretended not to notice. We chose a game we hadn't played in years, something from when he was still a teenager and I was still pretending to be someone's stepmother with confidence. The pieces were worn, some missing, but we made it work, inventing rules when we forgot the real ones, laughing at how bad we were at pretending to care who won. He let me beat him, obviously, not in a patronizing way, but I could tell toward the end that he'd started making choices that didn't serve his position on the board. I called him out on it and he didn't deny it, just gave a shrug and said, "You needed a win?" and smiled like he wasn't talking about the game at all. Then he leaned forward, just slightly, the light from the candle flickering against his cheek, and said, "I owe you a consequence." It was the kind of line that should have landed with a laugh, but it didn't. There was too much stillness in it, too much space between what we were doing and what we weren't saying. He moved, slowly, like he was giving me 100 chances to stop it, 1,000 chances to laugh it off or pull away, and I didn't take any of them. The kiss wasn't rushed or dramatic or even particularly romantic. It just was careful, unassuming, deliberate. The way you might press your palm to a door to see if there's heat behind it. There was no music, no thunder, no whispered names, just the sound of our breathing and the rain tapping at the windows, soft and steady, like a rhythm that had been waiting to happen. I let it happen. I didn't stop it, didn't flinch, didn't freeze. His hand brushed the side of my neck like it had every right to be there, and I let myself lean in, not because I didn't know better, but because something inside me, something quiet, and worn down by years of not being seen, reached forward before I could stop it. When he finally pulled back, he didn't say anything, and neither did I. We didn't need to. The moment had already changed everything, not dramatically, not explosively, but with a subtle precision that made it impossible to walk it back. We both stood a few minutes later, quiet again, the game half finished between us, like a scene from a movie we were suddenly too self-aware to continue watching. I said I was tired, and he nodded like he understood more than I was ready to admit. We walked to our rooms without touching again, the sound of our footsteps soft against the wood floors, and when I shut the door behind me, I leaned against it. For longer than I should have, unsure whether I felt like I'd done something reckless or simply something honest. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed with the window cracked open, listening to the last of the rain and trying to convince myself that what had happened was just a mistake, a fluke, a heat-of-the-moment blur that didn't mean anything. But the truth was, and I knew it even then, that it had meant something the second I didn't pull away. The next morning began the way mornings do, when something irreversible has quietly slipped into the space between two people, not with confrontation or chaos, but with a subtle rearrangement of behavior, a gentle shift in tone, a new layer added to every ordinary moment. He was already outside when I came downstairs, standing in the middle of the backyard with a rake in one hand and a trash bag opened, wide by his foot, moving with the kind of focus people borrow when they're trying not to think too hard. I watched him from the kitchen window for a minute before stepping outside, coffee in hand, pretending I didn't feel like the world had, tilted ever so slightly beneath my feet. We didn't talk about the kiss, not even indirectly. He asked if I could help carry out some old planters that had started growing mold near the shed, and I said yes without hesitation, grateful for something tangible to do with my hands. We worked for over an hour without really speaking, just small, functional phrases like, "Where do you want this?" and "Careful with that edge," and "Watch your step near the hose." It should have felt awkward, maybe even unbearable, but instead it felt like a kind of suspended reality. A space where we both agreed, silently, to pretend that nothing had changed, even though everything had. Each time our eyes met across the yard, there was something quiet and loaded there. Not longing exactly, but recognition, like we were both hyper-aware of the weight of that one small moment, and how much more it carried than we'd expected. It too, when I went inside to grab more trash bags, I found my phone buzzing on the counter with a voice message from Tom, not unusual, not unexpected, just bad timing. I pressed play without thinking and listened to his voice fill the kitchen like an echo from a life I was supposed to still be living without hesitation. He was cheerful, upbeat, making a joke about some client lunch he had just left, asking if I remembered to water the plants by the front steps because they were starting to look like orphans. There was nothing wrong with the message, Nothing accusatory or suspicious. And maybe that's what hit the hardest, the simple, steady rhythm of normalcy that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, then walked in just as the message ended, carrying a cracked clay pot under one arm. And I didn't jump or hide the phone, but I didn't move either. I just stood there, staring at the counter, trying to pretend that something inside me hadn't just recoiled at the sound of the voice I used to find comfort in. He didn't say anything about it, didn't ask who it was, didn't give me the look people give when they want to force a conversation you're both avoiding. Instead, he walked past me, set the pot gently on the sink, and went to the fridge to grab a bottle of water. Every motion deliberate and slow, like he was trying not to take up more space than he needed. But when he turned to leave, he glanced at me just for a second no longer, and the look he gave me was sharp in its clarity. Not angry, not hurt, not even expectant. Just knowing. Like he saw exactly what I was struggling to hold together and understood more of it than I was willing to name. I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to be tired, sitting on the couch with a book I didn't read, staring out the window at the garden we'd half cleaned, trying to understand how something as small as a kiss could rearrange everything that came after it. He stayed mostly outside, kept himself busy with things that didn't need doing, and the house took on a strange kind of stillness, like it was holding its breath with us. At one point, I looked up and saw him kneeling by the hydrangeas, water can in hand, head bowed slightly as he poured slowly over the roots, and I felt something sharp lodge in my chest. Not guilt exactly, but the painful edge of knowing I had let something real begin that I couldn't finish. Later, when I stood at the sink rinsing out my mug, I caught my reflection in the window, pale, tired, and too still, and for a moment it didn't look like me. It looked like someone who used to know how to feel certain about her choices. Someone who once lived her life like it was hers to actually shape. The worst part wasn't that I didn't recognize myself. The worst part was that I did. It was late. Again, one of those nights where the air felt heavy with heat that never fully left after sunset, and the house had settled into that soft, empty quiet that usually meant everyone had retreated into their own small private world. Tom had gone to bed early, his goodnight barely audible as he passed behind me with his usual tired, automatic kiss on the top of my head. The kind that used to feel reassuring but now felt like something I was just supposed to accept without thinking too hard about. I stayed on the porch after the door clicked shut, claiming the breeze as my excuse. But the truth was, I didn't want to go upstairs and lie beside a man who hadn't asked how I'd been sleeping in months. I wasn't surprised when Ben stepped outside a few minutes later. He didn't say anything right away, just sat in the chair beside mine and leaned back with that casual ease he wore like second skin, arms folded, legs stretched out in front of him, eyes fixed on the sky like there was something specific he was waiting to see. The crickets filled the space between us, loud but oddly comforting, and for a while we just let the silence sit there warm and familiar. Eventually, I turned to him, not because I had planned to, but because the question had been circling in my mind for days, and I couldn't keep swallowing it. Why now? I asked, voice lower than I expected, not demanding or dramatic. Just tired. Why'd you come back when you did? He didn't pretend to misunderstand the question. He didn't stall or joke or change the subject. He just turned his head slowly, met my eyes, and said, "Because I didn't want to feel like a ghost anymore." I blinked, caught off guard by the weight of it, and before I could respond, he kept going, voice steady, like he had been practicing the truth in private, and finally decided to say it out loud. I needed quiet. That was the reason I told myself, and maybe it's still partly true, but honestly, I think I was looking for something familiar that didn't feel like failure. And I remembered you, not just who you were to me, but how you made everything seem less blurry. I should have stopped him. I should have changed the subject or laughed it off, or reminded him we were sitting on the porch of a house that didn't belong to us. Not really, not anymore. But instead, I stared at him for a moment too long, my mouth dry, my heart doing that slow, painful thing it did when someone said something that hit too close. "I didn't think you remembered me like that," I said finally, and he exhaled, soft and low, as if the weight of the conversation was pressing against both of us at once. "Sometimes you find more than you came for," he said, not smiling this time, just watching me with that look he always had when he was waiting to see what I'd do next. I wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that this was just timing and nostalgia and bad judgment wrapped in loneliness. But I couldn't. I didn't believe it myself. Instead, I looked down at my hands, twisting the corner of the cushion under my palm, and said something that was supposed to be light but came out sounding like a confession. Well, I wasn't exactly hoping for house guests either. I wanted to forget it, I really did. I wanted to be able to sit there in Lena's backyard, drink cheap white wine, complain about emails and aging and whatever show we were supposed to start watching, and feel like that version of life was still accessible. But every time I laughed, every time I reached for the bowl of olives or nodded along to whatever story she was telling, a part of me kept replaying that half-second of silence between Ben and me, the way it had felt like the room had tilted slightly, like gravity had chosen sides. On the third morning, I didn't wait for Lena to wake up. I wrote her a note, the same way I had written one for Tom, except this one was filled with vague gratitude instead of excuses. I got in my car, turned the engine on, and sat there for nearly 10 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, trying to convince myself that going back didn't mean I was choosing anything, just returning to what needed managing. But the truth was, I hadn't been able to forget anything. Not the way he had looked at me when I stood by the sink listening to Tom's message. Not the stillness in his posture when he'd watered the hydrangeas. Not the kiss. Not the silence that followed it. And as much as I told myself that I was returning to my real life, I knew, even before the first smile ticked by on the dashboard, that it wasn't just about going back. It was about going back to a place I no longer knew how to belong to without lying to myself. When I walked through the front door, everything looked exactly the same. The stack of unopened mail on the console table, the faint scent of citrus cleaner in the air, the hum of the refrigerator kicking on just a second too loudly, and for a brief moment, I could almost convince myself that the last few days hadn't happened, that I had never left, and that everything inside me still fit the shape of the life I built here. I set my bag down quietly, unsure of whether anyone was home, and moved into the kitchen with the kind of careful slowness people usually reserve for unfamiliar places, even though I had lived in this house for years. The silence was too heavy to feel comfortable, not the peaceful kind that invites calm, but the kind that suggests something was either waiting to be said or had already been said in someone's absence. Ben was there, sitting at the kitchen table, with his laptop open and a glass of water in front of him, wearing the same sweatshirt he had arrived in days ago. Looking up the moment I stepped into view, not surprised, not unsettled, just waiting. He didn't smile, didn't rise from the chair, didn't offer any casual comment to make the moment easier, and something in me braced for whatever was coming before either of us spoke a word. I opened the fridge, not because I was hungry, but because I needed a second to collect myself, to find something inside the ordinary rhythm of movement that could help me act like this was normal. I pulled out the juice and poured a glass, then leaned against the counter and finally looked at him. Are you mad? I asked, not softly, not dramatically, just directly, because I couldn't stand the idea of tiptoeing through another conversation that wasn't honest. He closed the laptop slowly and looked at me without blinking, his face calm but unreadable, in that way that made me feel like he had already had this entire interaction with himself long before I walked through the door. No, he said after a moment, his voice even. I'm not mad. The space between us was too quiet for too long, and I could feel the question pressing in behind his answer. So I asked the next one without flinching. Then what? He tilted his head slightly and ran one hand across the edge of the table like he was grounding himself with the texture of it. I just realized something while you were gone, he said. You're not afraid of what people will think. You're not afraid of hurting anyone. You're afraid of yourself, I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that I had been protecting everyone, making the only choice that kept this house from becoming something none of us could live in anymore, but the words didn't come. Not because I didn't believe them, but because I knew he was right, and hearing it from him, spoken plainly and without judgment, made it impossible to keep lying to myself. He didn't wait for me to defend it. He didn't push or plead or try to reframe it into something more gentle. He just stood up, took his glass, and walked to the sink like it was any other night. Like we were still two people who had not crossed into the place where consequences lived. When he left the kitchen, I stayed where I was, staring at the open doorway, feeling the weight of every moment I'd spent pretending I could keep all of this separate. I had imagined a million versions of this conversation while I was gone. Dramatic ones, angry ones, desperate ones. But I hadn't expected this quiet clarity, this simple truth that left no room for denial. I didn't follow him. I didn't say his name. I didn't ask for anything. I just stood there with the juice untouched in my hand, watching the light shift across the floor, trying to understand how something so small could make me feel like I had already lost something I never fully allowed myself to hold. The dinner had been Tom's idea, an impromptu gathering with a few of our old friends. The kind of evening he liked to organize when he was feeling optimistic about the state of things. Convinced that laughter, good wine, and a few familiar faces could smooth over whatever wasn't being said inside our own walls, I went along with it, not because I wanted to, but because saying no would have led to questions I wasn't ready to answer. So I dressed in something comfortable but deliberate, applied just enough makeup to feel like I had control over my appearance, and practiced. A few neutral smiles in the bathroom mirror before stepping out into the kitchen to help arrange the drinks. Ben hadn't said much since the day I returned, not cold exactly, but distant in a way that left no confusion about the space he was putting between us, a quiet retreat that said, "I'm done asking." When the guests arrived, everything played out the way it always did. Warm greetings, harmless updates, mild complaints about work and kids and rising mortgage rates. I moved through the night the way I had learned to do over years of polite social choreography, nodding in all the right places, laughing just enough, refilling glasses before anyone noticed they were empty. Ben sat at the far end of the table, directly across from me, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable, his contributions to the conversation minimal but well-timed, a kind of presence you could mistake for comfort unless you were paying attention. The shift came quietly, the way those moments always do. Right in the middle of a toast Tom had decided to make after too much wine and just enough nostalgia to make him sentimental. He stood at the head of the table, his cheeks flushed, his voice rich with the kind of affection people mistake for depth, and raised his glass toward me with a soft smile that made my stomach turn before the words even left his mouth. "To my wife," he said, looking around the table as if everyone needed to hear it. "To my steady, loyal partner, the one person who's never wavered no matter what." The words landed like a sharp tap against glass, not loud enough to break anything, but more than enough to crack the surface. I felt the breath catch in my throat before I could stop it, and when I reached for my wine, my hand trembled just slightly, enough for me to notice, enough for Ben to see. I didn't look at him right away, but I could feel it, his eyes on me, not with anger, not with expectation, just with that unbearable clarity he had, like he was always seeing something I hadn't decided to admit yet. When I finally glanced up, he wasn't smiling, wasn't blinking, wasn't giving me anything I could hide behind. He just watched, and it was the stillness in his face that made it worse than anything else. Later, when the guests were gone and the kitchen was cluttered with empty glasses and forgotten napkins, I stood at the sink pretending to wash dishes I didn't care about, trying to let the water do something useful with the shame clinging to the back of my neck. Ben came in quietly, not looking at me at first, just setting a stack of plates on the counter before speaking in a voice low enough that it barely rose above the hum of the faucet. "You really believe that?" he asked, not sarcastic, not accusing, just flat and plain, like someone pointing out that the sky had changed color. I didn't turn around. "Believe what?" "That you're loyal," he said, and I heard the pause before he added, "or just quite enough to make it look that way." I shut the water off, wiped my hands slowly on the towel, and finally faced him. "That's not your question to ask." He nodded once, the kind of slow, quiet acknowledgement that didn't need follow-up. "No," he said, stepping back from the counter. "But you never ask it yourself either." And with that, he walked out, not angry, not abrupt, just done, leaving me alone in the kitchen with nothing but the smell of red wine and the sound of my own heart. Still trying to pretend it hadn't shattered days ago. It was late the following evening when we finally spoke, not in passing, not between dishes or over the rustle of grocery bags, but with both of us sitting still in a room that had become too small for silence and too quiet for pretending. The living room felt dimmer than usual, though the same lamps were on and the same couch creaked under our weight as we sat at opposite ends, legs turned slightly inward but not touching. The space between us filled with all the things we hadn't said because it had been easier, and somehow safer to hold our tongues than to say anything we couldn't take back. He didn't start with small talk, didn't try to cushion the moment with pleasantries or jokes, and I didn't either, because we were both past the point of pretending this was about misunderstanding or confusion. There was no confusion anymore, just consequence, just clarity, just the ache of knowing exactly what had happened and not knowing what, if anything, to do with that knowledge. "I'm not going to push you," he said finally, voice low, calm, almost too steady. "This isn't that kind of conversation." I nodded, not because I agreed or disagreed, but because I needed to do something with my body that acknowledged the weight of his presence in that moment. My throat felt dry, and for a second, I wasn't sure I'd be able to speak without cracking. "Somewhere in the middle, but I forced myself to anyway. I don't think I can choose," I said, not looking directly at him, but close. "Not because I'm unsure, not because I'm torn, but because the second I choose, everything shifts into something that doesn't feel real anymore." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly in thought, and I could tell he understood. More than I was saying, that he wasn't trying to make me explain every inch of it, because he had already walked that ground in his own mind. "So it's not fear of choosing wrong," he said slowly. "It's fear of making the whole thing mean less." I exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition. "Exactly," I said, and it felt like something unclenched between us, not in peace, but in mutual exhaustion. We sat there for a while longer, both staring out at a window that reflected more of the room than the outside world, as if even the night was turning back in on us, unwilling to offer escape. "I don't want to blow up your life," he said after a long pause. "I'm not here for that. I never was. I think I just needed to know what it felt like to not be invisible." I looked at him then, really looked, and what I saw wasn't longing or resentment or even hurt. It was understanding. And that was almost worse, because it made the rest of this impossible to frame as a mistake or a weakness or some brief failure of judgment. It had been real. That was the problem. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "a feeling isn't a reason to act. Sometimes it's just a signal that you're still alive." "And sometimes," I replied, trying not to let my voice shake, "it's the only reason you have." That was when I knew we weren't going to see each other again. Not because we wanted to walk away, but because we had already stayed too long in something neither of us could live inside without burning everything else down. When he stood, I didn't ask him to stay. When he crossed the room, I didn't reach for his hand. He paused at the door, looked at me one last time, and said, "I think you'll be okay. I just hope you let yourself feel it when you are." And then he left, no suitcase, no grand gesture, just the sound of the door opening, the soft scrape of it closing behind him, and the absence of footsteps after that. Like he had never been there at all. He left without ceremony, without any sound that would have signaled finality, without anything that might have allowed me to prepare for the moment after, the moment when the door stayed shut and the room stayed empty and the house finally settled into a silence that didn't feel temporary anymore. I had slept poorly the night before, my body twisted in bed sheets that no longer smelled like anything familiar, my mind replaying the same phrases from our final conversation until they began to unravel into something shapeless. I had known, even before I walked downstairs, that he wouldn't be here. I didn't expect a note, but there it was, folded once, resting on the kitchen windowsill in a way that made it feel deliberate but not performative, like he wanted me to find it, but not like he needed me to. The paper was plain, torn from a legal pad we kept near the phone, and the handwriting was unmistakably his, not rushed, not overly neat, just precise, like everything else he had been. The message wasn't long, wasn't romantic, wasn't bitter. It was just this: "Thank you for letting me feel something again. Don't forget that you did too." I stood there reading it 3 times, not because I didn't understand the words, but because I needed to be sure they were real, that the days I had just lived through hadn't been some emotional hallucination that I'd invented during one of those long, internal droughts that make people start dreaming of storms. I didn't cry. I didn't sit down. I just left the note where it was and stared at the room around me, noticing how nothing had changed except everything. I didn't touch the turntable he brought. I didn't play the records he left stacked beside it. I didn't throw them away, either, because part of me believed that touching any of it, even to clean, would confirm something I wasn't ready to call finished. Tom didn't notice anything, and if he did, he didn't ask. He came home from work with the same rhythm, The same distracted affection, the same assumptions about the way we functioned. He asked if I wanted to start looking at vacation flights again and suggested we might go back to Barcelona if we could both get the time off. I told him I'd check my schedule and smiled, not because I meant it, but because I had no energy left to explain the things that would make me seem ungrateful for a life most people would accept without hesitation. Days passed without event. But the color seemed to drain from the rooms one by one, not all at once. And not visibly, but in the way the house began to echo more at night. In the way the couch felt colder even with a blanket. In the way I stopped turning on music at breakfast. I ate standing up. I stopped making tea. I wore the same 2 sweaters even though the season was starting to shift, then had taken nothing with him. Not even the smallest memento to suggest that any of it had mattered, and maybe that was the point. Maybe he had left exactly as lightly as he had arrived because that was the only way he could survive it. But I felt him everywhere, not like a ghost, not like someone haunting the space, but like an imprint, a temperature change, a note still vibrating long after the music had stopped. Some nights, I'd sit outside with a glass of wine and stare at the fence we never painted, wondering if the cans in the shed were still usable, wondering if painting it alone would make anything feel less unfinished. I never got around to it. I told myself it was about time or daylight or motivation, but it wasn't. It was about standing too close to something we never quite claimed and not knowing how to touch it without starting to unravel again. There were no more texts, no quiet check-ins, no mistakes. Just a clean break that didn't feel clean at all, only quiet. Only final, only heavy in a way that no one else in my life could see or name.